Hey everyone, welcome to the show. It's kind of crazy how sometimes the very things we think of as progress, those big leaps forward, can end up having some pretty dark consequences. And the stories we tell ourselves about how amazing these innovations are, they can really obscure some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, that's so true.
Today we're going deep, deep into American Poison by Daniel Stone.
That's right.
It's this really gripping piece of narrative nonfiction. Honestly, it almost reads like a thriller at times.
I know.
It digs into the history of science and industry and public health all kind of tangled up together, and it really makes you think.
It does, and it makes you realize that sometimes the cost of progress can be higher than we ever imagined.
Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we're taking a close look at American Poison.
What's so fascinating about this book is how it tells the stories of these two individuals, Alice Hamilton and Thomas Midgley Jr. They're both brilliant in their own ways, but their paths and impacts couldn't be more different.
Right. You've got Alice Hamilton, who was this absolute pioneer in industrial toxicology. I mean, she dedicated her life to protecting workers from all these hidden dangers in factories and mines and, well, just about everywhere. People were working with hazardous stuff.
She was incredible, really ahead of her time. And then there's Thomas Midgley Jr., this
Yeah.
super talented inventor. He genuinely solved some major technical problems.
Yeah.
But his creations, leaded gasoline and Freon, ended up having these massive, global consequences. It's tragic, really.
What I found so compelling about American Poison, and you'll see this as you read it, is how Stone weaves these two seemingly separate stories together. You have Hamilton, facing all this resistance as a woman in a very male-dominated field, but absolutely determined to expose the dangers of these industrial poisons, how they were affecting everyday workers.
Yeah.
And then you have Midgley, the celebrated inventor. He's praised for solving these engineering problems, but it's almost like he's blind to the potential harm that his creations could unleash on a huge scale.
Right.
And the book doesn't present either of them as purely heroic or purely villainous. It's much more nuanced than that. And that's what makes it so gripping. You see the complexities of their motivations, the pressures they were under, and the long-reaching consequences of their actions.
Exactly. It's not about good guys and bad guys. It's about how complex these issues really are. And it's also about understanding the context.
Yeah, the context is so important.
I mean, we're talking about the early 20th century here. It was this time of just incredible industrial growth. There was this huge push for progress, for efficiency, for economic expansion. And sometimes worker safety and the environment, well, they just weren't top priorities.
Yeah, that tension between the drive for progress and the need to be cautious, well, it feels so incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? I mean, think about all the debates we have now about technology and its impact. For me, the parts of the book that focused on the long-term consequences of leaded gasoline and CFCs, those were just, I don't know, they were almost chilling to read. Because now we know, right? We know the damage that lead does to brain development, the effects it has on kids, the widespread contamination. And then CFCs, how they tore a hole in the ozone layer.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that even innovations that are intended to improve our lives, to make things better, can end up having these unintended devastating consequences on a global scale.
And what's so fascinating is that, Midgley was a brilliant chemist. There's no doubt about it. Leaded gasoline, it did solve a problem that made cars run better, more efficiently. And Freon, it seemed like a miracle at the time. It was safer than the old refrigerants, not flammable.
Right.
But the book makes you think. It forces you to grapple with the ethics of it all. Like, how far does the responsibility of a scientist go? Does it end with just inventing something? Or does it extend to thinking about the potential long-term consequences, the risks, the impact on human health and the planet?
Yeah. It's a tough question, and it's one that we still wrestle with today.
Definitely. And then you have Alice Hamilton, who dedicated her entire life to understanding these dangers, trying to mitigate the harm that was being done. Her work at Hull House, seeing firsthand the toll that these toxins took on communities, it was just incredible. She was meticulous in her research, and she faced so much pushback, so much skepticism, but she never gave up.
No, she didn't. She was a real fighter.
She laid the groundwork for the entire field of industrial hygiene in America. I mean, think about that.
It's amazing. And it wasn't just about identifying the problems. She actively fought for solutions, for regulations to protect workers.
Absolutely. And, it's so interesting to see the contrast between their approaches. I mean, Hamilton was driven by this deep sense of social responsibility.
Yeah.
She cared about the people she was studying, the communities that were being affected. She wanted to make things better.
Right.
Her investigations, they were so thorough. She was documenting everything. And her advocacy, it was all aimed at making workplaces safer,
Yeah.
preventing harm. And she wasn't afraid to stand up to powerful industries to make that happen.
Yeah. That takes a lot of courage.
It does.
Whereas Midgley, well, he was brilliant, technically brilliant, but his focus seemed to be much narrower. He was all about solving these technical challenges. And it seems like there wasn't as much thought given to the bigger picture, to the potential long-term impacts.
Right.
I mean, there's even this anecdote in the book where he downplays his own experience with lead poisoning. He was showing symptoms, but he kind of brushed it off. And that really highlights the difference in their perspectives.
That's a really important point. Makes you think, right, what's the responsibility of an inventor? How much should they be thinking about the potential downsides of their creations? I mean,
Hmm.
American Poison really makes the argument that they have a huge responsibility to consider those things,
Yeah.
that it goes way beyond just the intended use of a technology.
And the resistance that Hamilton faced, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Even when the evidence was mounting, clear evidence that lead was poisoning people, that these industrial chemicals were making people sick, factory owners, they just denied it.
It's crazy, isn't it?
They questioned her findings. They refused to implement safety measures. They said it would hurt their profits. It's like, wow, really?
I know. And what's interesting is that at the time, insurance companies in Germany were already studying worker illnesses.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they were trying to reduce their payouts.
Hmm.
So they had an economic incentive to actually understand the risks.
Huh, that's fascinating.
It is, right. It
Yeah.
shows how powerful those economic forces can be. And the book also talks about the role of public awareness, how the media can shape perceptions. Like, think about the early days of the automobile. It was all about freedom, the open road, and refrigeration. Everyone loved having a fridge.
Yeah.
But that made it really hard for the warnings about the dangers to break through. It often took tragedies, really awful events, for people to start questioning the narrative.
Right. And when we look at ethyl gasoline specifically, Midgley's invention was celebrated as this huge breakthrough. No more engine knocking, more power, more efficiency. But there were warnings even at the very beginning from scientists who understood just how toxic tetraethyl lead was.
Exactly. People like Reed Hunt, Yandell Henderson, Robert E. Wilson, Eric Krauss, they were raising serious concerns.
But those concerns were largely dismissed, or worse, they were actively suppressed by companies like General Motors and the Ethyl Corporation.
It's like they were so focused on the potential profits that they just didn't want to hear anything that might jeopardize that.
Right. And then there was this big public health service conference in 1925. It was supposed to be about addressing the growing concerns about lead, but it ended up being, well, it was basically a stage for spreading misinformation.
It was, wasn't it? I mean, industry representatives, especially this guy, Dr. Robert Kehoe, who was funded by Ethel, they presented all this data that minimized the risks.
Right.
And independent scientists like Yandell Henderson and Alice Hamilton, they were there trying to present the real evidence, but they were sidelined. It's heartbreaking, really. It's like, how many times do we have to see this happen?
Right. It's a pattern that repeats itself, even today. When powerful interests want to protect their profits, they often resort to the same tactics. Sowing doubt, discrediting scientists, delaying action. It's infuriating.
And so, despite all of Hamilton's efforts, despite the growing body of evidence, ethyl gasoline, it stayed on the market for decades.
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It is. And it took researchers like Claire Patterson who really meticulously documented the extent of the lead contamination.
Wow.
And then there was Dr. Herbert Needleman, who showed the link between even low levels of lead exposure and cognitive problems in children. It's like it took all of that to finally start changing public opinion and to force policymakers to take action.
And by then, the damage was done. Millions and millions of people had been exposed to lead for generations. I mean, it's a public health disaster of epic proportions.
It is. And it wasn't just an American problem. Ethyl gasoline was being sold all over the world. And often, governments went along with it. They prioritized economic growth over the health of their citizens.
It's a sobering thought. And then there's Midgley's other big invention, Freon. At first, it seemed like a miracle. Non-toxic, non-flammable. It was such an improvement over the old refrigerants.
And Midgley, he was so confident about it, right?
Yeah.
He inhaled Freon in front of an audience and then blew it out onto a flame to show it wouldn't ignite.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It's almost surreal looking back on it now, knowing what we know.
Because as we now know, Freon and other CFCs, they had this devastating impact on the ozone layer.
Yeah.
And it took until the 1970s when scientists like Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland discovered just how destructive CFCs were to the ozone layer that things started to change.
And that ultimately led to the Montreal Protocol and the global phase-out of these substances. So it's this incredible and kind of unsettling parallel,
It
right?
is.
Two inventions that seemed so beneficial at the time, that were praised for their safety and utility, and they both ended up causing massive environmental damage, damage that affected the entire planet and human health.
And in both cases, there were warnings, right? There were scientists raising concerns based on sound science, but they were ignored.
Or dismissed. Or actively silenced.
It makes you wonder what innovations today might be viewed with the same kind of regret by future generations.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. The epilogue of the book, it really brings the whole narrative full circle. You know, it talks about Hamilton's legacy, her impact on the field of industrial hygiene, and then Midgley's legacy, this complicated legacy of innovation and unintended consequences. And it connects those stories to some of the environmental challenges we're facing today, like the whole issue with PFAS, the forever chemicals.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to be really critical, that we need to ask tough questions about the technologies we embrace, to not just accept the hype.
Yeah, and to be willing to listen to those who are raising concerns, to those who are speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. People like Alice Hamilton, who is so dedicated to protecting public health, even when it meant going up against powerful interests.
Well, I think we've certainly taken a deep, deep dive into American Poison today.
Like so.
It's a book that will stay with you. It will make you think differently about the world. It's a 4.5 out of 5 stars from us, for sure.
Definitely. A must-read for anyone interested in science, history, public health. I mean, it's just such a relevant story, even today.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. If you found this exploration of American Poison insightful, please like and subscribe to the show. We'll put a link to the book on Amazon in the description below if you want to check it out yourself.
We'd love to hear your reactions, too. What surprised you? What was your favorite part of the discussion? Let us know in the comments.
And if you think this episode would be interesting to someone you know, please share it. The more we can talk about these important issues, the better.
Exactly.
Thanks again for tuning in to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.